Hello, everyone. I think we can start. Good morning to Europe and good afternoon to our Asian audience. Thank you all for joining this webinar. This event is a first joint initiative between our offices of Singapore and Hong Kong at LPA-CGR with our colleagues of Audier Partners. Today, we are going to speak of Vietnam with a particular focus on the opportunities of investment in that exciting, fast-growing country from Singapore and Hong Kong. Before we deep dive in the topic, allow me to please first remind a few rules governing the organization of this session, which normally appear on your screen. Your microphone is muted. You can send us your questions via the chat room. We will organize a Q&A session after the speech. A satisfaction survey will be launched after the webinar. Your participation will only take 2 seconds, so thanks for your participation in this. And finally, the PowerPoint presentation will be sent to all participants after the webinar. So to start this webinar, Vietnam is probably the most exciting country in the region at the moment. It is among the only places in the world expected to have a positive GDP growth this year, despite the economic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. Vietnamese population has impressively resisted to COVID-19 with less than 2,000 cases, while being geographically at the entry gates of China, thanks to a fast and efficient policy of isolation of contaminated people. Beyond its ability to tackle the pandemic, Vietnam also benefits from a young and dynamic population and a stable political system. I could continue this list of good indicators for long, but will now let my colleagues do their presentation. To begin with, Nicolas Audier and Etienne Laumonier, who are the founding partners of Audier Partners, and also my former colleagues during my time in Vietnam, will introduce the latest trends and opportunities in Vietnam. After their speech, my colleague, Nicolas Vanderchmitt, partner at LPA-CGR and head of our Hong Kong office, will focus on the structuring of international transactions into Vietnam from Singapore and Hong Kong, highlighting why these two jurisdictions are key for transiting overseas investment in Vietnam. As I highlighted, after the presentation, we will hold a Q&A session and answer any question that you may have. So I invite everyone here to submit their queries in writing, and we will ensure to relay them to the relevant speaker. Nicolas, Etienne, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Good morning, everyone from Paris. Good afternoon from our friend in Hong Kong and Singapore. We are very happy with my colleague and partner of our firm, Etienne Laumonier, to be here today, especially with our friend from LPA. We have been working together a lot over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And of course, Arnaud, I remember when you were working in Vietnam, so I know you have a great knowledge of and expertise on Vietnam. We feel today, with LPA and our firm, we feel it was important today to share with you the recent development we had in Vietnam. We all know that we have the COVID-19, but we have also very exciting news in 2020, and I'm sure you all know that yesterday the RCEP, which is a big free trade agreement among China, Japan, and all the ASEAN countries, has been signed yesterday. So that's good and positive news for Vietnam. Considering also that in 2 months we have the next Party Congress in Hanoi, which will be held in 2021, so it is important to share with you the last development in Vietnam. Maybe 1 minute about our firm. We are a boutique law firm, and of course we are working a lot with our friend LPA from Hong Kong and Singapore. We have offices in Hanoi because it is the capital of Vietnam, and an office in Ho Chi Minh City and in Myanmar as well. In Vietnam, we have 30 lawyers, and in Myanmar, we have 5 lawyers working in Myanmar. On the speaker, myself, I've been working and living in Vietnam since 1993, and I've seen all the wave of foreign direct investment in Vietnam. The first one was in 1990, the second with WTO, And I would say that the third wave of the FDI started 1 or 2 years ago with the impact of the China-US war and all this FTA which has been signed and ratified over the last month. A slide on my colleague and partners of our firm, Etienne Laumonier. Etienne is working a lot on establishment of new companies in Vietnam, but also a lot on the M&A, merger and acquisition project. And he has also outstanding knowledge, expertise on competition law, because Vietnam has a strong competition law which apply to any M&A where we have a Vietnamese asset. So today we have 3 chapters we will discuss. First one will be exploring the new opportunities, the law and practice of investing in Vietnam, and the international perspective from Hong Kong and Singapore. Maybe some slide on the COVID-19. We're all living in Asia where the COVID is an issue. Vietnam managed to handle the coronavirus in a very professional and proper way. So far, as of October 31st, 2020, unfortunately, but only, I would say, only 30 deaths has been associated to the COVID. But the downside of this of the coronavirus, of the success of the management of the COVID-19, is that Vietnam is in confinement, and there is no foreign tourist in Vietnam, no foreign delegation can come to Vietnam, and if you come to Vietnam, you need to have a proper visa, and you have a 14 days quarantine to do in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. I understand there is some discussion to have a special corridor with Singapore, and maybe with Hong Kong, but so far only Singapore seems to be on the agenda of the government of Vietnam. Exploring new opportunities. I think we have put some slide about what is happening now in Vietnam. Despite the COVID-19, Vietnam will have a positive GDP in 2020, which will be around 1.5%, which is, and we have to come to the crisis in 1997, the Asian crisis, to have a GDP which is below the 7%, but still Vietnam will have a positive GDP in 2020. As some 2 other countries in the region, we have Myanmar and Brunei, which are the 3 ASEAN countries which are expected to have a positive GDP in 2020. So that shows the positive view of Vietnam from the foreign direct investors in Vietnam. We have put a slide on the FDI. So despite the crisis despite the corona crisis in Vietnam, you will still have an inflow investment, foreign direct investment in Vietnam. In 2019, we had 20 billion US investment. We are, as of October 2020, to 11 billion, which is of course not as much as 2019, but still a positive signal given to the foreign direct investors in Vietnam, if we see with other countries in the region. The slide on the export and import of Vietnam. This slide has been drafted Friday, but that doesn't take into account the last FTA which has been signed over the weekend, which is the RCEP. And you will see that Vietnam will have a positive trade. They will reach 6-7 billion positive in 2020. The volume of trade of Vietnam is 420 billion US of trade, export and import. And Vietnam, at the end of the year, is expected to have a positive trade balance, thanks to all this EVFTA, CPTPP, US, and the impact on the US-China trade war. Okay. I put some slide on the traditional indicators of Vietnam, which were valid in 1987 of the Doi Moi policy and still valid in 2020. The population of Vietnam is still very, very high population, and 96 million inhabitants. The growth rate, the average gross GDP was or is 7% ex-COVID. The GDP per habitant is more than $2,700 US. When I came to Vietnam, the GDP was $100 per habitant. Today is 30 years after, it's $2,700. It's a growing middle and high income class, very young, large, and dynamic workforce. And it's a cost competitive workforce. And as we have seen with the foreign direct investment in Vietnam, many of them are coming to produce in Vietnam garment, textile, and the shoes industry. Vietnam is very open to the foreign investment. A lot of foreign free trade agreement has been signed and are now implemented, so that will increase the Vietnamese integration to the global economy. So Vietnam is still an export-oriented country. A lot of, as we see, 2020 will be a positive trade balance for Vietnam. It's connected to the ASEAN EC, and now to the China, Korea, and Japan, thanks to the RCEP. So it's connected to a very dynamic region. It's a vibrant economy, and it's supportive ecosystem. Now I'll let my colleague Etienne to give you the last legal development in Vietnam. Thank you very much.
So before going into the legal development themselves, I'd like to spend maybe a few minutes to present you what are the key sectors or most dynamic investment sectors in Vietnam. As Nicolas did mention, so we have a positive growth in Vietnam. It's supported by let's say export and export processing. If we look at the trade balance of Vietnam, we see that import and export are clearly connected. So Vietnam is actually transforming raw materials, equipment, tools to make a new product. If you look at the key product, Nicolas did mention garment, shoes, and textile. That is still the case, but the key export from Vietnam are now computer parts, phone, machinery and equipment. So they did raise quite high on the value-added chain, and the fact that Vietnam is still growing is also because it's selling and supporting the worldwide economy. So we will see on the long run whether with the pandemic, if it's a consumer market, which would be mainly Europe and the US, will continue to be able to absorb Vietnamese production. So Vietnam has been really one of the key benefactors from so the economic attention between China and US. It has managed to integrate itself within a web of free trade agreements. So the RCEP is the latest one, but it's one of the few which have a free trade agreement with Europe and one of its key exports. So if we look at the export and the investment of themselves, first investment is in the export and the production and the processing industry. The second one would be more, maybe not in volume. Investment in the sectors which are presented on this slide is, let's say, the more dynamic. It's not where the most investment are, but that's in the dynamic view where many investors are choosing Vietnam now. So we have an appealing tech sectors with some nice fintech and e-commerce. So we will discuss it later on to see how Vietnam, in its recent legal reform, is supporting those sectors. The second hot sector would be renewable energy. So all type of renewable energy. I mean, hydro has been one of the sectors where we had significant investment in the past. So most of the hydro projects or rivers are tapped already. But then if you look at the solar farm, wind farm, biomass project, we see that many investors are coming in. The pledge of LPA in those sectors is high. However, the delivery is still a bit lagging behind, but we will be able to come back on those sectors later on. Then we have still a keen appetite from, let's say, more private equity investors for education and healthcare sectors, which have seen significant move and significant investment in the past. But there are still a lot of opportunities in those two specific sectors. I mean, I have been in Vietnam for the last 20 years, and so we still see say, a selection of 3 other sectors where investments remain strong. There's been the subject of many discussions over the 20 years I have been in Vietnam. The first of all would be the infamous private-public partnership. I'm sure that all of us we have heard about those prospects for Vietnam. They are actually quite nice opportunity, maybe more for local investors to develop those projects, and then for foreign investors to take over once the projects are developed. But we will be able to discuss that in later slide. SOE is still strong, and there is a lot of opportunities for investors there. Bearing in mind there proper due diligence and would be well, it's more a quiet taste and not suited for every investor. So coming back to those hot sectors, I wanted to show you this slide, which I find very interesting. It shows you a mapping of fintech companies around 5 countries of within ASEAN. So we see that Singapore is leading the pack, followed by Indonesia. But Vietnam has still some good assets. So if we look at those companies, so we could look at what we call those unicorns. There is actually one which is worth mentioning, would be the entire Zalo ecosystem, which is so Zalo is actually an app which gives you access to all types of services, from e-messaging to e-wallet, social network, and these purely Vietnamese apps, actually several apps in one, is competing head-to-head with the largest one, so Facebook, Amazon, and is among the most popular one in Vietnam. So it's we see that there are a lot of opportunities in there. So coming back briefly on those renewable projects. So Vietnam has put in place a regulatory framework for every type of a single source of energy. It's really for us, it's quite a nightmare to follow, because it's changing so fast that we have a new regulation every weekend. The latest good news, which does not appear on this slide, but it's just to show you that everything is changing so fast, there will be a proposal from the Ministry of Industry and Trade to actually extend the feed-in tariff for an additional period of 3 years. So for those which are in that sector, there were a kind of a cut-off date, which would be a commercial operation by December this year to secure access to quite advantageous feed-in tariff. So it seemed that the Ministry of Industry and Trade had made a proposal to the Prime Minister to extend those feed-in tariff for an additional period. So there will be more breathing room for those investors which would not manage to reach a commercial operation by next month, basically. So that's, I mean, we will be able to discuss it in more details if you have a question during the Q&A. I will move briefly to education and healthcare. That's one very attractive sector. I guess it's everywhere. The same in every country. Every parent wants to have the best education for their kids and live a healthy life. So healthcare and education have grown quite fast. There have been a number of movements over the past 2 years, but there are still significant opportunities there. The key change would have been that in the education, the limit was actually the number of foreign students. For any foreign invested school or foreign program, you had to enroll a minimum number of foreign students, where also school actually wanted to care first for Vietnamese students. So there were a competition to get access to attract a sufficient number of foreign students to be able to increase the actual intake for all students there. And so there have been a lifting of the cap. So for healthcare, maybe one good thing for people investing from Singapore, compared to other countries, you have a bit of a premium being within the ASEAN, as for those sectors, compared to, let's say, someone in Paris, you will not have to comply with minimum capital requirement for opening those, let's say, for the clinic, a polyclinic, or hospital. As a reminder, opening an hospital is a minimum ticket of 20 million, a polyclinic is 2 million, and a single clinic is 200,000 US. So in Singapore, those capital requirements are 50. Before we move on to other sectors, just to show you a brief view of so the Vietnam index. As you see, it has recovered quite fast from the pandemic impact, and is a good way for investors not to enter into Vietnam, because it's a market which is still a bit shallow, and where the sharing of information is not still challenging, but it could be a good way to exit for an investment. We can discuss it. We can discuss that topic later on also. Just one brief slide on those PPP. So as I told you, it has been one of the recurrent topic for seminars and conferences, where many investors have tried to tap the opportunities which were offered by those projects. Unfortunately, there have been only very few foreign invested projects which have taken off. However, and that's maybe what happened, or this moment will increase with the new law on PPP that we will discuss in a few minutes. There is a whole ecosystem of local PPPs which have been put in place and which are functioning quite well. And we have seen a number of investors being successful in investing into a portfolio of projects, initially locally invested, rather than launching a larger scale foreign invested PPP, where those one have been lagging for many years. To move on, let me present you one of the reasons why we choose to do that seminar right now is that Vietnam has actually passed in July 3 laws which would enter into force on the 1st of January 2021, so in 1 month and a half now. New law on investments, new law on enterprise, a new law on PPPs, among others. So we will maybe discuss each of them in more detail. For those, I mean, to be able to understand better how to invest in Vietnam, for those which may be less familiar with the country, you have to be mindful that when you invest in Vietnam, you need to think in a different way than an investment in Hong Kong or in Singapore. In Hong Kong and Singapore, you will maybe establish a company and you will decide what you will do with that company later. In Vietnam, it's completely the other way around. First, as a foreign investor, you need to validate an investment project with the authority. And then once your project is validated, you will be able to establish a company and possibly later on apply for operating license. As a matter of fact, operating license in Vietnam are quite rare. As for any foreign investment, you get its prior approval on your project. So that's the purpose of the law on investment, is to regulate what type of investment project could be implemented. So it's a common law applicable to both local and foreign investors. What has really changed with this new law on investment is that now we have, or we will have, a negative list. So to make it more clear, until this law, Vietnam was only allowing what was specifically provided. So you need a specific provision, specific disposition of the law, which would allow you to conduct your investment. With this new law on investment, it's a complete change. We have a list, or we will have a list in a decree, which is still in draft, of what sectors would be prohibited for investors, what sectors will be conditional, and what condition will apply, and the rest will be open. So as investors or as lawyers in Vietnam, for us, it's a complete change of working environment. So we would be able maybe to discuss what sectors would be open or not in the Q&A. So in more of a M&A point of view, so we have, when you invest into Vietnam, because also the sectors are either open, conditional, restricted, any investment, so either greenfield or through purchase of shares, would be subject to an approval. And so what would be the trigger is if you reach a 50%, or if you reach, if a target company is operating in one conditional sector. So those new list of sectors and the clearer definition or the ownership threshold, which trigger M&A approval, is a welcome change for Vietnam. So that seems to be quite a good news, but this new law has also introduced some limitation. So it's always a kind of a check and balance in Vietnam. Vietnam is willing to open, but is trying to keep some control over what type of investment. investment would be allowed into the country. So the National Assembly has put some safeguard by introducing a bit of loose wording relating to national security, access to land, the use of obsolete technology, the risk of environmental pollution. So at each step of approval with the local authority, we have some items which could lead to the authority having some margin for maneuver to appreciate whether or not to approve a licensure project. One of the good development also, and it's going echo with what we have discussed before, is some easier investment requirement for startups. So as I told you before, in Vietnam, you're supposed to first validate your investment project, which should fit within the boxes which are available there, and then you're allowed to establish your company. So for startups, the new law on investment allow to the investor not having to apply for an investment project, go directly to establish their company and have more room for operation outside of the boundary of the investment registration process. In terms of for the fintechs then, which go supporting to the finance and banking industry, the State Bank of Vietnam is launching, will launch shortly, a Sandbox, where all startups which would qualify will have a 2 years period during which it would be able to operate with looser supervision and with a rendezvous clause after 2 years for the most successful project, and possibly getting back into the common track. So again, a check and balances. So we have this opening on startups, but then we have also the introduction of a new means for the authority to stop a project or to terminate a project. And we think that one of the objective of the authority in that perspective is actually to target all type of nominee scheme. So in some sectors which were previously limited, which will be limited in the future, foreign investors have relied on some type of nominee agreement. And so we have new wording in the law on investment, which would put those type of arrangement or setup at risk. So you should be very careful when launching or when going for those type of route of nominee investment in Vietnam. So moving on to the next law on enterprise. So again, compared to what you have in Singapore and Hong Kong, I know that Arnaud always mentioned, I received the question, what type of company can I establish? I think in Singapore it's pretty easy, where in Vietnam we really have two different types of companies. So limited liability company on one side and joint stock company on the other side. Each have a corporate governance which is a bit different. So you have to keep that in mind. So to make the long story short, ASC will be simpler company from 1 to 50 investors, where you have only one member council, which would be the equivalent in other jurisdiction of the general meeting of shareholders and the board of management merged into one single entity, and then one director or several legal representative or directors which manage the day-to-day business of the company. And then you have the joint stock company, which is more similar to what you will find in other jurisdictions. So with the first figure being the general meeting of shareholders, a board of management, and then directors in charge of the daily management of the company. So to continue, basically the law on enterprise, what it has brought is the simplification on the corporate governance. It has put a new definition on the responsibility for multiple legal representatives, which was an improvement in the past. We still have a very tight control on the related party transaction, even tighter than before. So in the past, related party were transaction with related party were considered null and void if they were possibly causing damages to the entity in Vietnam. It's not the case anymore. As long if it's not properly approved, it would be considered null and void by the court. We have some enhanced minority shareholder protection, so mostly applicable for joint stock companies and streamlined majority. So before, just to make sure we stick to our timing, minority rights were accessible with a 10% stake in the company. Now it has been reduced to 5%. Basically, there have been also some improvement, a little bit less of reporting to do, which give us some more breathing room to deal with the authority. In the past, reporting in Vietnam is very challenging and take a lot of time. So any improvement on that front is welcome. I could discuss the PPP sectors, but I think that if you have questions, we will be able to go through the specific specific law. The key message being again that this new law is a revamping an existing regulation, and as I see it, it's now very suitable for local investors launching local PPP, not necessarily fitted for foreign investors. So on that, I would invite maybe Nicolas to continue on more on the Singapore and Hong Kong perspective.
Thank you, Nicolas and Etienne. Indeed, Nicolas Vanderchmitt now will discuss international perspective on investment to Vietnam from Singapore and Hong Kong. Nicolas, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So Audier has given us an overview of the recent legal developments and opportunities in Vietnam. On my side, I will tend to have a more global approach and will focus on this topic, so investment in Vietnam from the perspective of international investors. So when your decision is made to invest or conduct operations in Vietnam, the next question is how you will conduct such investment, which vehicle you're going to use, from which countries you're going to invest. If you team up with partners, financial or commercial investors, in which jurisdiction it is preferable to locate your joint venture. And then, of course, all the tax questions, issues you may have. What would be the tax impact if you repatriate money out of Vietnam after your investment? What would be the tax treatment at the time of the exit, etc., etc. These are all complex issues which are key and must be considered before you start your investment in a specific country. And today we are talking about Vietnam. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide you with relevant, useful feedback, experience sharing of what we've seen, what kind of structure we've put in place for our clients, so as to give you some tips on investment structuring for your transaction in Vietnam from a legal, financial, and tax perspectives, and to show you the advantages in structuring your investment through Hong Kong and Singapore. With Arnaud Bourrut-Lacouture, we do have extensive experience in structuring cross-border transactions all over Asia, from Hong Kong or Singapore. And maybe let me say a few words about our firm and our practice. So at LPA-CGR, we are a leading French and international law firm with around 230 lawyers covering all areas of business laws, from corporate M&A, tax, employment, litigation, bank finance, energy, real estate, and so on. As I said, we are a French and international law firm. French because our main office is based in Paris, and because we do have French qualified lawyers in all our offices. International because we are one of the very few French law firms with a strong footprint overseas. We have 12 offices over 3 continents. In Europe, we are based in France and Germany, where we have 3 offices. In Africa, more particularly in North Africa, Algeria, and Morocco, and Cameroon. And we are in Asia. In Asia, where we have offices in the 4 key Asian financial centers: Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, and Tokyo, and we are as well in Dubai in the Middle East. As I said, we often advise clients in structuring their projects all over Asia, in particular clients who invest in Vietnam. So let's focus on investment made by international investors in Vietnam to discuss about some common features, tips, and pitfalls. So Hong Kong and Singapore are 2 essential locations to structure investment in Vietnam. And what we can observe is that the commercial and economic ties between these 3 countries are increasing over the years. In 2019, among 125 countries who had investment projects in Vietnam, Hong Kong and Singapore were in the top 3 countries in terms of total investment. So Hong Kong ranked 2nd with almost $8 billion of investment capital, accounting for more than 20% of the total investment capital into Vietnam. Singapore ranked 3rd with $4.5 billion of investment capital, representing almost 12% of total investment capital. Next. And what we can observe is that investment from China through Hong Kong tend to increase recently due to the impacts of the US-China trade war. Specifically, investment from Hong Kong increased 2.4 times compared to 2018, which represents a big rise. So where is the investment going? FDI, so foreign direct investment, mainly focused in Vietnam, as Nicolas and Etienne reminded, mainly in the processing and manufacturing sector, which represented almost 65% of total registered investment capital in Vietnam in 2019. It is followed by real estate sector, wholesale and retail sector. Next. So why Hong Kong and Singapore are popular locations for investing in Vietnam? There are many reasons, but I would like to focus on the three main ones, the one which appear to be absolutely key. It is interesting to invest in Vietnam through Hong Kong or Singapore for financial, legal, and tax reasons. And I will start to focus on the financial considerations. Investors usually set up an investment vehicle in Hong Kong or Singapore because these are places where it is easy to finance activities. They are, so Hong Kong and the Singaporean platform are in the top 4 of the worldwide global financial centers after New York and London, and they are the largest international hubs in Asia. Hong Kong and Singapore consistently ranked among the world leaders in terms of stock market capitalization, IPO fundraising, asset management, banking, and insurance. And they are ideal locations if and when you would like to seek and raise money from financial investors of different categories, from business angels, family offices, venture capital, private equity funds, or financial institutions. Money can be raised with a huge variety of instruments, ordinary shares, of course, or various classes of shares, offering preferential rights to investors. Can be convertible loans to match the interest of financial investors, etc., etc. So it's not restricted at all, as you may all know. Hong Kong and Singapore are among the first business environment in the world as well, because of their open markets and their limited restrictions. Next. There is a great flexibility to structure and finance projects from Hong Kong or Singapore. It's not necessary to obtain authorization or to carry out some sort of registration for capital increase or extending shareholders loans. There is no constraint regarding payment of capital contribution or payment of purchase price, and we may discuss this with Audier, and we face the same issue if the participants have had experience in China, in particular at the time of a transfer of shares, when you have restrictions to when you issue shareholding interest to pay the subscription of such shareholding interest, or when you transfer shares to pay an earnout. There is no such restriction in Hong Kong or Singapore. And as well, there is no debt or equity ratio. So you may finance your top holding entity in Hong Kong and Singapore through shareholders loan or partially through capital contribution without having to observe any specific ratio. And finally, there is no, as you may know, no specific restrictions for foreign investment in Hong Kong and Singapore, except in a very few limited sectors of activities, and there is no exchange, no foreign exchange control. It's worth considering Hong Kong and Singapore to structure investment in Vietnam from a legal perspective as well. Hong Kong and Singapore offer a unique flexibility to organize rights, obligations between partners. In a shareholders agreement, you may decide various policies for voting rights, rights to dividends, majority rules, the rules to amend articles of association. You will not find such flexibility if your rights are structured directly in Vietnam, but that would be the same in other Asian countries, I would say, not governed by common law. Hong Kong and Singapore also offers great flexibility to reallocate shares in private limited companies, either through capital increase or transfer of shares. There is no authorization, no registration when you allot new shares or when you transfer shares. One of the most important common features in Hong Kong and Singapore is probably their independent legal system, which is based on the British common law system, which is very familiar to most of international groups. The concept of the rule of law is key, is the cornerstone of the legal system in Hong Kong and Singapore, and a key factor explaining why investors choose Hong Kong or Singapore as their top holding vehicle for their investment in Asia. And it's not surprising to observe that the vast majority of regional headquarters for international groups in Asia are based either in Hong Kong or Singapore. So when you are an investor, you choose Hong Kong or Singapore. Maybe the slide before, just to finish, Arnaud. When you choose Hong Kong or Singapore, it's because you know that in case of conflict between partners, meaning that when you wish to enforce rights under a shareholders agreement, for instance, you know that you can enforce your rights before an independent and impartial court, and this is for an investor priceless. And to finish, it was on the slide before, one key factor is the International Arbitration Center that you will find in Hong Kong and Singapore, either the Singapore International Arbitration Center, SIAC, or HKIAC in Hong Kong. There is as well for European companies, the very known ICC. They are based in Hong Kong, they are based in Singapore, and when it comes to deal with conflict, dispute, it's very reassuring to know that you have all these international arbitration centers in these two jurisdictions. Next. So in this slide, we have tried to sum up through a chart what is the common structuring of an investment in Vietnam with international investors. So they often use a vehicle outside Vietnam, so either Hong Kong or Singapore, for all the reasons I mentioned. And this holding vehicle will hold the operating company in Vietnam. So 100% of this shareholding will be held by Hong Kong or Singapore vehicle. Let's have a look now on, after the financial aspect, the legal perspectives, the financial, the tax consideration. You all know that Hong Kong and Singapore have and enjoy a very simple and low tax jurisdiction, very low profit tax. There is, and I wanted to focus here on few aspects. When a company based in Hong Kong or in Singapore receives dividends, Hong Kong or Singapore will not tax the dividend received. And as I said, there are many regional headquarters in Hong Kong or Singapore, so it's very important to know that in Hong Kong or Singapore, we will enjoy no tax when we will repatriate dividends. When the Hong Kong or Singapore vehicle will distribute its own dividends abroad, let's say in Europe, European, or in the US, there will be no tax at all in Hong Kong, no withholding tax of such repatriation of dividends. And last but not least, and this is key, of course, for all entrepreneurs and companies, there is no tax on capital gain. So at the time of the exit, when you transfer your shareholding interest either in Hong Kong vehicle or abroad, the Hong Kong tax or Singapore tax authorities will not tax the capital gain generated. Next, on this slide, I wanted to mention, but this is of course very important, and this explains why investments are made through Hong Kong or Singapore, is the fact that everything is cross-border. And this is key for Hong Kong and Singapore to secure financial transactions between these two platforms and other countries in Asia. And this is why Singapore has the lead, by the way, by entering into double tax treaties with other jurisdictions. Singapore has signed 90 DTAs, so double tax treaties, double tax agreements with other countries. Hong Kong has reached 47 DTAs, so they are making some progress. And why a DTA double tax treaty is important? First of all, because it reduces the tax level, the tax impact between flow of funds, and I will talk about distribution of dividends later on. And secondly, it will secure transactions because it will avoid double taxation between two countries. And of course, this is key for companies and individuals. On the next slide, I will, so we have tried to be very pragmatic and to give you example of an investment made through Hong Kong. We have taken the example of an investor in France investing through Hong Kong or Singapore, holding an operating subsidiary in Vietnam. What is the tax impacts when we repatriate dividends? Because after all, after the investment, the shareholders are willing to get profit from the subsidiary. What is interesting to see in this chart, and we have taken the example of dividends. When you repatriate dividends from Vietnam to Hong Kong or Singapore, there is no tax at all in Vietnam, no withholding tax. There will be no tax in Hong Kong or Singapore. When Hong Kong or Singapore will distribute its own dividends to abroad and to France, for instance, there will be no withholding tax in Hong Kong or Singapore. So at the end of the day, you will be able to repatriate 100% of the dividends in this example to France free of tax. For royalties, we've given an example, not in the chart, but just to summarize, there is an advantage going through Hong Kong or Singapore because the withholding tax, when you distribute royalties, when you pay royalties from Vietnam to Hong Kong or Singapore, so royalties meaning that there is a license agreement between the top holding and the Vietnamese company. So top holding licensing IP rights, a brand, for instance. The Vietnamese company will have to pay taxes, and there will be a withholding tax that will be reduced thanks to the double tax treaty between Hong Kong and Singapore. On the next slide, I will give you a word on the exit. As I mentioned, it is of course very important to structure an investment and to think about what would be the tax impact in a few years. So we have assisted companies with venture or PE fund investing in target, and they have an investment line of 5 to 7 or 8 years. So it's important to know, to anticipate what would be the tax impact. What you need to have in mind is in Vietnam, under the domestic regulation, the taxation of capital gain will depend on the type of company who would sell the shareholding interest, or the type of vendor. It can be a corporate, it can be a, an individual, and it may be between 20% or 0.1% of the sales price. If you have any question, we may discuss this in more details. But there is a taxation. What is important to know is, thanks to the double tax treaty between Hong Kong, Singapore, and Vietnam, there is a possibility to sell your shares without any tax impact in Vietnam. There is some specificity, some limitation in Hong Kong when you sell more than 50% of shareholding interest. But except for that, and except for real estate companies, you may have a very tax efficient exit going through Hong Kong or Singapore. Let's discuss now about another type of exit. So we've seen that according to the double tax treaty, Vietnam should not be the jurisdiction who should be able to tax. It should be Hong Kong or Singapore, and there should be no taxation except in specific circumstances. Sometimes the exit will be done not by selling the shareholding interest in the Vietnamese company, but in the holding entity. And as I said, in Hong Kong or Singapore, when you transfer shares in these two jurisdictions, there should be no tax on the capital gain. So that should be very attractive. However, what you need to have in mind is that it's difficult to have there are recent precedents which show that the tax authorities in Vietnam have tried to impose capital gain when there was an indirect equity transfer, and therefore there is an uncertainty. And we have had a few practical cases, and maybe Arnaud, you would like to share.
Oh, yeah. Yes, Nicolas, indeed, it's a good illustration of I think what it is to do transactions with Vietnam. You have rules in principle, and sometimes you have uncertainties, such as, for example, this question of indirect transfer. We were faced recently with two cases. One was clients based in US, and the US companies had been the subject of a leverage buyout transaction, LBO, in US. And the question that they were asking was that they had a Vietnamese subsidiary. And when we ask and when we did a review in Vietnam, what is a bit uncertain is whether the Vietnamese tax authorities could potentially ask taxation at the level of the Vietnamese subsidiary for such a transaction happening entirely in US on this principle of indirect transaction. So that's a raising concern, and it's a bit uncertain. What we see in general, and especially when we speak with our colleagues, for example, of Audier, is those kind of transactions which are taxed by Vietnamese authorities are those who are public, for which there are communications in the media, in the press. Because from what I understand, the Vietnamese authorities perhaps do not have the means to check any transactions happening overseas. So I think people should have a high level of caution when they do this kind of indirect transfer of shares, and of course seek advice from a Vietnamese local counsel.
Yeah, thank you, Arnaud. And this is, this was highlighted in the slide. So in practice, there might be some uncertainties that will have to be sorted out at the time of the transaction. Yeah, the next. In the interest of time, I will try to be quick. Just a word on this one. So we've seen before we addressed the issue of repatriation of passive, what we call passive income, meaning basically dividends. Here, an example of repatriation of active incomes. So it may be the sale of products or sale of services. Two main ideas you need to have in mind. First of all, in these three jurisdictions, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Vietnam, there is transfer pricing rules, which means that all intra-group transactions must be made at arm's length. And there might be an investigation by tax authorities to ensure that transactions are made at based on arm's length principle. The second aspect I'd like to focus on is the payment of service fees. Under the double tax treaties, there should not be any withholding tax in Vietnam on service fees paid by Vietnamese companies to companies residing either in Hong Kong or Singapore. However, in practice, there might be withholding tax of 10% applicable on such service fees by the local tax authorities. And this is not consistent with the DTAs, so it will depend on a case-by-case basis on each transaction. So we've seen that it's interesting from a tax standpoint to structure investment from Hong Kong or Singapore to benefit from the double tax treaty. But one pitfall, there are a few. What we would like to share with you is, and I know that some companies, some groups are structured with a holding entity which may not have enough substance in Hong Kong or Singapore. This was probably less an issue a few years before. This is extremely important to focus on this aspect nowadays. If in Hong Kong or Singapore, you have a holding entity without economic substance, and I will just elaborate very quickly on what we mean by economic substance. If you don't have any economic substance in Hong Kong or Singapore, you will not be able to obtain your tax registration certificate, and therefore you will be denied all the benefits deriving from the double tax treaties. This is the first comment. Second observation is, if you lack of economic substance, there might be the so-called CFC rules, anti-avoidance rules applying in other countries, and typically France have such kind of anti-avoidance rules, and will try to penalize investors who will use a vehicle without enough substance, and will try, let's say, not enough substance in Hong Kong or Singapore vehicle. All the profits generated by this vehicle will be taxed in France. Last comment, if you don't have any enough substance in Hong Kong and Singapore, and you do invoice, you do generate profits, you have income, there is a strong risk that such income, such profits may be taxed abroad, where the activity is effectively conducted through the concept of permanent establishment. And typically, if your holding entity has profits, although all the employees, all the activity, the economic activity is made in Vietnam, you will have a high risk of being, if there is a tax investigation of reassessment by the Vietnamese tax authorities. Last word about what we mean by substance and to avoid such risk. It does not mean that you don't have to structure your investment from Hong Kong or Singapore if you do not have any substance, because the substance is something that may evolve as the time passes. So if you start an investment at the beginning, it may be, you may explain why there is not enough substance, but after a few years, and if your entity generates profits and income, you need to justify having having governance, having day-to-day businesses, having employees, having offices based in Hong Kong or Singapore. And the level of that substance may differ on a case-by-case basis, of course, and that will depend on the level of income and profits generated. So what we do usually when you start structuring an investment, you need, or when the investment has been done, but you want to reorganize your activities, first thing you need to do is an audit on assessing the functions of all your operations and the functions of your holding entity to see, you know, what are the responsibilities and duties related to the activity conducted by the holding. And of course, this is the last slide I wanted to share, is the fact that the profits, but I had a word on it, the profits located in Hong Kong or Singapore shall adequately match the level and nature of the activity carried in these two platforms. So you shall not invoice, you shall not generate profits in Hong Kong or Singapore if you have no employee, if you have no office, if you have no responsibilities associated to these two, this holding entity, which may be in Hong Kong or Singapore. Otherwise, you may face very strong tax risk, and you may say, well, I'll take the risk. But we have had on many occasions the problem advising clients at the time of the exit, of the sale of their entities, who faced tax risk, which was eventually spotted by the buyer, of course. And then you have to engage discussions on reps and royalties, and it will be a very high burden to discuss, and you need to allocate the risk. It would be a long discussion, so it's better to anticipate this issue at the beginning of your investment.
Thanks a lot, Nicolas. Thank you again, Nicolas and Etienne from Audier Partners, for this overview of Vietnam and for this perspective on structuring investment into Vietnam from Hong Kong and Singapore. I guess it's a lot of information for everyone and not easy to digest. So of course, as we said, we will be happy to share the slides, and you should feel free to send us questions. We already received a few questions that I will be happy to share with the speakers. First, on my side, I had one question for you, Etienne and Nicolas in Vietnam. When we do transactions relating to Vietnam, we actually have two kinds of transactions from Singapore. One is two foreign investors, two foreign entity. It could be a European company and perhaps an investor in the region. Most of the time, everything will be structured in Singapore, and the underlying assets are in Vietnam. Basically, it's quite easy for investors to structure their agreements in Singapore. There is the rule of law, as Nicolas explained. It's easy to describe to set out all the rights and obligations of the parties, to protect the interest of everyone in an agreement that everyone knows will be enforceable before the courts. The second kind of transaction is when we advise again international clients, so coming from Europe, United States or Asia into Vietnam, and then in that case the investment will most of the time be directly into Vietnam, simply because use of a holding with a Vietnamese party is complicated due to control of change, etc., etc. So my question is the following: what would be your advice to foreign investors in order to prevent any risk of conflict and dispute in future with a Vietnamese party, either through the structuring of the drafting proper agreements or perhaps the choice of jurisdictions. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that and any updates that may have happened since my time in Vietnam in the 2000s.
Maybe to start with, there are two layers to your question. There is the pure legal answer, which will be, so be mindful of your jurisdiction clause and your applicable law clause. So mostly to answer the pure legal question, foreign law is usually acceptable for to be applied for contracts. As a matter of practice, in terms of clause of jurisdiction, we tend to avoid Vietnamese courts because they are often biased toward local investors and not be functioning based on the rule of law. You will tend to prefer foreign arbitration if there are assets abroad. That's despite the difficulty to enforce those foreign arbitral awards. Strangely enough, local arbitration may not be the best venue. Between two arbitration, we would usually recommend to go to foreign arbitration. But then, I mean, that's when the conflict already crystallized. Obviously, what you should be mindful is doing your homework. So you should really get to know your partner, knowing exactly what type of activity he's doing, who he is. So it's a get to know game, and due diligence is the key. So you really have to be very careful and very patient in the structuring or in the initial phase of your investment, not rushing into structuring something and taking maybe a longer time to make sure that you have dotted every I and crossed every T.
Maybe to add something on Etienne, when you establish companies in Hong Kong or Singapore, it's always with foreign investors. It's difficult, not to say impossible, to have Vietnamese investing abroad. You have a law on Vietnamese foreign investment abroad, but it's complicated because you need the approval of the Central Bank of Vietnam, and sometimes, depending on the level, you have to go to a higher agency in Vietnam. So when you establish a company in Hong Kong and Singapore, it's always with foreign company, never. So the only way to prevent any issue is I mean, Vietnam is a difficult country, so you have to know the Vietnamese company, whether it is a state-owned enterprise, if it's belong to one of the ministers, if it belongs to People's Committee, if it's a subsidiary of a SOE. So you have to understand your partners. The good news now in Vietnam, you have more and more private companies, SMEs and private companies, and some even are listed on the stock market, but it takes some time to establish good relationship with your Vietnamese partner. Now, to prevent, of course, when you have a Vietnamese shareholders and your Hong Kong or Singapore company, you have, now this is a practice, but you can have, of course, shareholder agreement where you organize yourself the way to manage the companies in Vietnam. But the main concern we have in Vietnam is arbitration. Hong Kong, Singapore are very safe, recognized, you have the rule of law, you have the common law precedent, it's well known. However, the concern we have is to enforce in Vietnam an arbitration from Hong Kong and Singapore. So it's why when we have a shareholder agreement, many or most of the parties, foreigner and Vietnamese, they select the law of Vietnam and they select what they call the VIAC. They use the VIAC, which is the Vietnam International Arbitration Center in Vietnam, to handle their potential conflict.
Thanks a lot. It's very helpful. Please don't be shy to ask questions. I have one at the moment. We have another 2 minutes, so you should feel free to use this time for our speaker to answer any question. Yes, one topic that perhaps has not been addressed is the question of structuring a network of distribution into Vietnam. And the question precisely is, can you introduce quickly the difficulties for franchise businesses? Again, I think Etienne and Nicolas, it's a question for you.
So actually, distribution is a strategic sector. So there are many opportunities in Vietnam for that, and we discussed it in the presentation earlier. So you basically have two ways. Either you make your own investment, and the difficulty is for foreign investors, the opening of your flagship shop would be easy, not a problem. The difficulty would be to establish a chain of distribution, because for any additional outlet, if you're a direct investor, or if the company which is operating the distribution network is considered foreign invested, you will need to obtain a license for any single retail point, retail outlet, and demonstrate that there is an economic need for that outlet in that specific location. So it's quite a burdensome process, and it's leaves a large room for maneuver and appreciation by the local authority. So some investors, and that's the second business model, will tend to offer a franchise, so either as a primary or secondary franchise. So nowadays, foreign invested franchise need to be registered with the Ministry of Industry and Trade, and need to be already operating somewhere for at least 2 years, from what I remember. So first, you need to have a track record, and then you need that registration with the Ministry of Industry and Trade. It's the franchise disclosure document is very extensive. It's quite long. You will need to get into very much detail of every single fees that it will impose on the franchisee. So it's possible. It's not that easy. And then the thing is finding the right location. Again, that's for both retail structuring. Location is the key, and in the key urban centers, finding those spaces is highly competitive. So it's a challenging investment.
Maybe one thing is important, that Vietnam has already be happy, always welcome investment with expertise, knowledge, transfer of technology, and complicated investment. It was very difficult to have in Vietnam commercial investment, and distribution is part of what they call the commercial investment in Vietnam. And the good news that thanks to the EV-FTA, Etienne mentioned this economic need test. With a new ratified, implemented EU-Europe Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, the economic need test will be over. So there is no test for a company coming from Europe investing in a network of commercial centers in Vietnam. The issue for big players, and I'm sure you have read all the news on big players in Vietnam trying to establish a commercial network, the access to land. In the big city like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh, it's very difficult to find any more land. And so the only option available will be to lease a long-term lease to existing building where they have a podium where you could sublease the property. But the access to that property is difficult, highly competitive. But people may, because you have some company coming from Europe, and it's good to know that now the economic need test will not be anymore requested for EU investors.
Okay, thanks, Nicolas and Etienne. Another question that perhaps is more for Nicolas Vanderchmitt from Hong Kong. We were speaking about the question of the substance, having substance for an entity in Hong Kong. And the question is the following: if my headquarters is based in Hong Kong and I put all my substance in Hong Kong, does that mean that for Vietnam I just have to open a representative office and I can bill everything from Hong Kong, or shall on the other side open a real legal entity in Vietnam? And in that case, what are the risks?
Well, I would say that if you have substance in Hong Kong, then you should not face the risk I mentioned in the presentation, which is no substance and therefore no possibility to benefit from the double tax treaty and from all the reduction of tax in case of repatriation of dividends, for instance. So there shouldn't be an issue. If you think about, you have substance, then your question is, what type of vehicle should I have in Vietnam? Will I guess, and I will give the floor probably to Etienne and Antoine, but will depend on the type of activities you will run in Vietnam. If you have a rep office, you are not supposed, I guess, to Vietnam to conduct a commercial activity. So it's probably mainly to liaise with buyers, suppliers. But as long as you start deploying commercial activities, you will have to have another type of entity. And at the end of the day, the question of substance, meaning it's a combination of factors, employees, the location, will depend on the responsibilities, duties, and role of your vehicle. So if you have in Vietnam a company or an entity which has employees but which does not conduct a commercial activity, more liaison work, then yes, there should be no, well, you could have an invoicing made by your Hong Kong entity, but you will have to have some sort of agreement between the rep office and the Hong Kong or Singapore vehicle to make sure that all the costs in Vietnam are covered by the top holding.
Thanks, Nicolas. I think we're coming to an end, so it's now just time to thank everyone for your participation. Again, that was very interesting, and I hope everyone enjoyed. Feel free again to follow with us if you have any question or anything. We will not, of course, forget to send you the slide of the presentation. So goodbye, everyone. Have a lovely week, and speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.